Dale, we're gonna go ahead and record just through Zoom. We're not able to get the live feed through YouTube, but we can start. We have a quorum to start.
Okay, let's get this going. We apologize for the delay. We'll try to get this on YouTube. So I'd like to do the call of order for the Regional Transportation Commission of Washoe County Regional Road Impact Fee Technical Advisory Committee. Today is Thursday, May 27th, 2021, and the time is 8:38 a.m. So Yenny, let's start with a roll call, please.
Alex Velto, Amy Cummings, Ryan Stewart,
Here.
Jim Rundle,
Here.
John Krompotich,
Here.
John Erickson,
Present.
Kelly Mullen,
Present.
Craig Knudsen,
Here.
Larry Chesney,
Here.
Mike Michelle,
Present.
Mitchell Fink,
Here.
Randy Walter,
Here.
Shelley Reed,
Here.
Ted Erkin,
Here.
and for the RTC, we show in attendance Lane Peterson, Dale Keller, Jelena Williams, Leanne Olivas, Stephanie Haddock, Xuan Wang, and myself, Yenny Russo. If I missed anyone, please let me know.
Hi, this is Amy Cummings here as well.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Hi, Yenny. This is Dan Deb. I didn't hear if you called my name, but just for the record.
So Yenny, it looks like we have a quorum.
You have a quorum, yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. So let's move on to item number 2, public comment. Yenny, have we received any public for today's meeting?
No public comment was received.
Okay. No action is required by the committee. Moving on to agenda item number 3, approval of the agenda. Any discussions on the agenda, or is there a motion for approval?
This is Kelly, move to approve.
Second.
We got a motion by Kelly, second by John Erickson. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes. So we have the approval of the agenda. Moving on to number 4, consent items. Any discussion on consent items at this time? Hearing none, may I have a motion?
Move to approve.
Second.
And
We'll go second by Shelley. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes. Moving on to the heart of the agenda, agenda item number 5, and we'll start off with 5.1, acknowledge receipt of a report of the RRIF General Administrative Manual GAM update and the draft fee schedule proposed to be included in the Capital Improvement Plan CIP for possible action. So I am going to lead this agenda item, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, everybody can see my PowerPoint presentation, I assume? Okay, thumbs up. All right, let's get started. So today is going to be the conclusion of what we've been presenting for the last 2 to 3 months now as we've gone through this development of RRIF fees. So we started out in the red group with what the planning exercise did in conjunction of TMRPA, as well as our travel demand model and our regional transportation plan shown in green there. Last month, we talked about the growth and calculating that number of VMT. And so today's presentation is going to focus on the cost side. And then as is shown in the red circle is the updated and proposed RRIF fee schedule by land use for the 7th edition. So as we discussed before, and agenda item 5.2 is going to talk a little bit more in depth about the growth inputs. I know we had some comments from the committee, so we're going to, Schwinn's going to provide a little bit more detail in the next agenda item about the growth inputs, but this is how we generate the overall VMTs, basically from the population and employment, from TMRPA and their consensus forecast, understanding the trip lengths by service area from the travel demand model, and what the trip length is on a regional road network. Then we take into consideration the different trip generation rates and land uses from the ITE 10th edition trip generation, and this helps us develop the VMT for development units. This is a slide from last month as well. So this is what's being proposed for the 7th edition based on the 2030 daily average trip lengths. In the north area, we have a 3.58, those are miles. And in the south area, we have a trip length of 3.36 miles. And you'll see here on the VMT growth by service area, now this is over that 10-year period. In the north area, shouldn't be too surprising that we see more VMT growth in the north area, and that's over 325,000. And you see in the south area is roughly 194,000 new trips in that 10-year period. On the cost side, and this is some of the cost inputs as we go through the exercise and the analysis to calculate the cost impact is first we start with what the projects are included in our capital improvement plan, and that's developed by service area. Then we go through the exercise of analyzing the costs attributed to new development. We also consider other revenues that are identified in the RTP and what we project for the next 10-year periods. That includes federal funds, state funds, and local funds. And those local funds is a combination of fuel tax, sales tax, as part of that funding formula. And then lastly is the trip generation rate by land use, and that gives your overall development units. And by the end of the day, and what we're presenting today is the dollar per VMT associated with the proposed 7th edition. So the next steps of this process is understanding what is developers' new share and understanding from our RRIF CIP what's identified as capacity related. So our CIP, the RRIF CIP is taken from the regional transportation plan for the first 10 years. And you see, we go through the exercise of seeing where the projects fall, either in the north area or south area, get that total. Then we relate that to capacity related projects between the north and south. You see the overall dollar amount of capacity related projects. And as we tease this out from, this is projects only, so this does not include programmatic programs that have been identified in RTP, sensor payment preservation, or some of our traffic spot projects. So this is just strictly projects that we have identified within the next 10 years of the RRIF CIP. And so those are the percentages between north and south as we relate that to understanding the breakdown of the overall cost per service unit. Another consideration as we talk to is part of that, what is needed and what's developers' fair share regarding to those impact fees and new development. So the revenue used to fund these projects in the RTP, as I previously said, is a combination of federal, state, and local and regional revenue collection. And so you see that second table for the regional fund sources, we see fuel sale and RRIF. Things to point out as we calculate the overall RRIF share, we take into account what our RRIF funds would need be, and that's in that second column there, excuse me, second table under RRIF. And if we go back to the top table, you see the other revenues. And this is something as we go through the exercise is not only do we take into account what we collect from potential revenue sources, we also look into what potential other labor offsets do we see forthcoming based off privately funded roadways on our regional network system, and other ones that we can anticipate and have on the books in the next 10 years. So at the end of the day, we get to this total RIF share of roughly $132 million. So we take the overall RIF share and then we divide it back onto those percentages of RIF eligible RTP based off those benefit districts between North and South, what we've shown previously, and that's all related to capital or capacity improvements between the two benefit districts. And then we break that down for VMT growth over those two service areas to get your dollar per VMT for RIF share. This table is just an excerpt from the attachment A as part of the agenda packet showing the proposed RIF, RIF fees per development type and what the fee impact between single family units from industrial up to commercial, then other service areas such as lodging, schools, hospitals, and so forth. The attachment A does provide a further breakdown, and we can have further discussion about the percentage increase and the differences between the 7th edition and 6th edition. And let's talk about briefly about some of those comparisons before we jump into those conversations. So just some highlights of those comparisons is first is the 2030 VMT per development unit has significantly increased. And that's based off the new travel demand model that we've incorporated part of the 2050 RTP and the consensus forecast. And that's pretty consistent. And we're going to get a more further discussion with Schwinn here in the next agenda item, but that shouldn't be too much of a surprise to anybody on this call. Second is the ITE trip generation. Trip lengths reflect the updated 10th edition. The previous 6th edition still used a combination of the older version, the 9th. So everything was brought forward to the updated 10th edition. Of course, this CIP is going to be different than what we see in the past from even from the 5th and 6th edition, because now we have a new 2050 RTP, and those the updated RIF CIP projects reflect that. That fourth bullet point too is that the CIP cost attribute to the new development is less. So we talked about now the new total is about 135,000. In the previous 6th edition, that was roughly about $175 million. And the last one here, the RIF fees reflect more growth within the North Benefit District. And you see that from the overall total number of VMTs growth that we see in the next 10 years, in addition to the number of projects we have in the North Benefit District. So next steps is we would like to receive your input today on some feedback on this current draft fee schedule. At their next June and or July RIF TAC meetings, we'd like to present the whole package, meaning the whole updated, any of the revisions from the GAN manual as well as the overall CIP manuals, and have that presented in a version for you to review and get your input. So that's what the next 2 months we'd like to do. We're working here with our consultant Tischler Bias as well as Adam Spear for legal review. So those are the next steps forthcoming. So at this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we can pull up the attachment A. We'll open the floor to the committee at this time.
Hey, Dell, I have a general question, and I apologize for the question coming onto this committee towards the end of this process, but can you tell me where the boundary is between what you identify as the North and the South benefit area?
A good question, Shelley. So it's just the I-80, Interstate 80 is the dividing line. So everything north of I-80 is going to be north, and then south is south of there. So makes it fairly simple. It's very simple.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, we've got a question for you too. This is Kelly. And this is just following up on our earlier conversations, and so the rest of the group knows Dale and I have been kind of speaking offline. The city of Reno still has interest in exploring some potential strategies for continuing to incentivize affordable housing construction. We know that the the Reno City Council had interest in the possibility of looking at strategies for this. As we went through the RTC process, talking about options for the RRIF schedule. We have a number of policies in our adopted master plan, in the regional plan, in that Truckee Meadows regional strategy for housing affordability specifically talked about looking at potential strategies for incentivizing construction of affordable housing through reducing or waiving impact fees for those projects. So it's something that we're still interested in pursuing. And Dale, I just wanted to reiterate that here today.
Thank you, Kelly. I think one thing that we would need to do with the local administrators is get together from the agency standpoints and really vet through that option and understanding the impacts to this potential 7th edition and see if this is something worth incorporating and need to buy off of from each of the entities or something we need to take a look at a future time. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
This is Randy Walter. I've got a couple of questions. My first question kind of goes back a few months. I'm still interested in understanding how the trip length between the 6th edition and the 7th edition went up 30% in a matter of a few years. I still don't have a good explanation for why that huge increase. My other question revolves around the comparison between the 6th and 7th. By the way, thanks for that piece that you sent with the agenda. That's very helpful. We're looking at, if you just look at some of the major characters that make up the fee, the trip length is, again, one of my major concerns. The RRIF share of improvements from 06 to 07, or from the 6th edition to the 7th edition, get my terminology straight, is about 20 to 23 million, depending where you're north or south reduction. The VMT increase actually went down in the south, went up just a little bit in the north. And the capital cost per VMT went down in both cases. Then you look at the fee structure, and single family went up 6 or 7%, depending whether you're in the south or the north. Parks and Rec went down 65%. I'm not sure where that came from. Everything else is within 0.5%, either up or down. So the only two outliers are single family and Parks and Rec. So if you could address those two and the differences between what's going down versus what's going up would be really helpful.
Sure, Randy. I appreciate those questions. And I'll start with the easy one, public parks. This was an update between the ITE 10th edition and 9th edition, which changed the overall trip generation length. So that one significantly decreased, roughly about 60-something%. So that was just applying the updated one, reflecting, being consistent with the ITE approach. So that's why you see a big decrease on that number itself. Moving on to residential housing, and as you point out, you saw roughly about a 28 to 27% increase across the board on VMT growth between the north and south benefit districts. You do see a greater increase of VMTs per housing units, and that's roughly about 35% or so, or 36%. And so that's why you see that at the end of the day, over to the right column here, the 7% and 6% growth, because that's roughly the percent more than what you see on these other different types of industrial or development types. And why is that? Two things is we, and then previously in the past, and it still makes sense to do the same apply. We apply the regional overall VMTs per that dwelling based on Washoe County itself. In the past editions, we used a 2012 community survey that was based off of number of vehicles per households, how many people are traveling, how many people are in each of the dwellings, and so forth. So that was the previous between 5th and 6th. And with the 7th edition, we update that to the 2016 edition. So there's changes that came out into the calculation of how many cars per household there are, and that reflects a greater increase than what was previously shown in 2012. One thing also to point out too, as we look into this VMT number of trips that it generates, all the other types of calculations in there regarding pass-through traffic and so forth is still roughly the same. Also, if you were to use the ITE trip generation length for single-family dwellings, it's more than what we have here in Washoe County shown. So this approach is very specific to Washoe County.
Okay, so you used a survey from the trip length question. You used a survey from, let me get the date straight, 2014 or the 2012 versus 2016?
16, yes, sir.
Is that correct? So that's a 4-year difference in survey. And that generated a 30% increase in trip length.
Correct. So that's part of it. Not the 30% increase in trip length. What increased the 30% increase in trip length was based off the travel demand model. What I would say increased the additional 6%, 7% roughly would be the one from the community surveys and the number of vehicles in that trip, right? So if you take a look overall, you see everything roughly flat. To your point, the VMTs roughly increased about that 28%. So that makes sense.
It's just hard for me to justify the percent increases from just a few years. That's my basic concern. I understand that you've changed processes and changed models, but that's a pretty significant change.
Hey, Dale, would this also be attributed to development occurring further out from the core?
Yes, John, and I think that's the presentation we're going to see from Schwinn next, is talking about the overall increase of average trip length you see on the top of the spreadsheet here from 358 to 279. Yeah, and that's definitely part of that trip increase of what we see, the further growth expansion outward, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Dale Krompatic here on the same topic. Isn't it really saying we're sprawling on single family at a much greater rate than the rest of the land uses? Because all of these are, I mean, to me, it's basically a 0.5% across the board, plus or minus, right? On difference between 6th and 7th edition. And I'm talking about on the right column now, and then you go up to 6 or 7%, depending on north or south for single family. I mean, I just looked at the simplest level and go, what's going on there? Because it's very consistent otherwise. Isn't it the rate of sprawl or the...
John, that's a great point. Just my question is, and I'll just pick the South just because I have to pick one of them.
I'm sorry, I don't...
This is Eric.
Okay, you're chopping up. Who was that?
Oh, it's Ted. Can you not hear me well?
Now you're coming back. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Like, so for the South, we're talking single family sprawl. So what sprawl? I mean, what for the South, just as an example, like real world, what sprawl is any different there than what we had 4 years ago? The most southerly major development in the South is Caramel Ranch. It's actively building. St. James has been there since 1990. I worked on that project as a young man. So, I mean, what's pushing the trip length in the South? It's just an example. I mean, in North, maybe one could argue, I don't know, Stonegate wasn't entitled then or something, although, I mean, Cold Springs listener stuff has been out there forever. But what's the new thing that's driving it, I guess, is just my question. Real world. So,
Ted, this is Dale Keller, and John, maybe to help answer your question too, is I would like to go back to the statement I made regarding these travel surveys. So this is a big component of why we have this increase. Is And we can pull this as the next agenda item to show you the difference from 2009, 2012, and now using 2016 on how many vehicles a single family household has. And that relates specifically to Washoe County. So what you see previously from the 2000 or from the 6th edition and the 5th edition, we were using the 2009 National Household Travel Survey. Now we're updating that to the 2016 one. And so you see different residential development accounts that account for roughly 121% of the average trip length. So when you have these different multipliers, as we get into that, you see that additional increase. So if you compare that to a commercial development, those trip lengths are roughly about a 66% of that average trip length for non-residential things. So you have a higher factor, which makes a lot of sense because every trip it generates from a house to work or somewhere else. So that's why you have a larger average trip length based off some of these factors that go into that calculations for residential development.
Yeah, I'm still not buying the 30%.
And I'm more than happy to, if the community would like to see us break down between that, and we can also talk about, and Randy, just so I can understand fully exactly your concern is more so of the overall average trip length than how you see these other increases.
Yeah, I gotta keep muting and unmuting. Yeah, it's really, I'm just looking at it from a practical standpoint. Somebody else that's looking at this is not familiar with all the pieces that go into it. You look at some of the general percentages, typically everything's staying relatively similar. That 30% increase in trip length is just, it's huge in the formula for calculation. And you know that, you know as well as I do that that's a big number. So I'm just really curious as to how we got there and something that can be justified to other folks that are looking at it, because that's a pretty high percentage.
Randy, are you stuck on, are you talking about the single family trip rate, or are you talking about the average trip length between 6th and 7th edition? Is that what you mean by the 30%?
Yeah, the average trip length, which goes into the formula, is what generates that increase in single family for sure, because that's the one that's driving it. And that's the one that's creating the average trip length increase. It's just 30% to me just seems out of character. If somebody can explain to me why the differences are, we may have been underestimating it over in past years. That's very possible. That's what I need to look for. That's what I'm looking for, some justification for that number.
And that's a good segue for our next presentation. So I don't know if there's any other concerns on anything else we identified here on this draft impact fee schedule.
Dale, I've got a motion for if you'd like.
Yeah, that sounds great. Go ahead, Kelly.
Move to acknowledge receipt of the report on the RIF GAM update and draft fee schedule proposed to be included in the CIP, and just adding in the notes of following up with additional information for Mr. Walter, and then noting also the desire to investigate those potential strategies for affordable housing.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Shelley. All in favor, please say aye.
Hey, Dale, typically you can have discussion after the motion.
Yeah, go for it. Jim, would you like to have some discussion?
I would, Dale. So the motion is a receipt of a report. To add in other components of further direction concerns me I think it was just kind of more of a discussion item as opposed to an opportunity to provide direction to RTC. So on the affordable housing component, I'm a little concerned with the motion.
And Jim, I'm happy to take that piece out. It's something I know that Dale has indicated he would be working on anyway to provide additional information, and we'll have further discussion with the group at the next meeting, is my understanding anyway. Is that accurate, Dale?
So correct. I think this is something that we can take back, but I don't know if we necessarily need to have it within the motion of acknowledge this report.
I'm happy to remove that part.
So Jim, does that?
Yeah, if it's taken out and Shelley's okay with changing her second, then I could support the motion.
I'll second the new motion.
Great. So the motion on the table is acknowledge receipt of a report of the GAM update and the draft fee schedule proposed for the CIP, then also to address, have staff go back and take a look at the concerns raised by Mr. Walter. So did I get that correctly, Kelly? Head nod. So any other further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Moving on to agenda item 5.2, acknowledge receipt of a report of the average trip length measured in miles, including the regional travel demand model forecasting model. So this presentation will be by Ms. Xuan Wang. Xuan, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, so this is Xuan Wang with RTC Planning. So I'm going to give a presentation today to go over the methodology we use to calculate the average trip length, and then we'll have a comparison of the previous version and the current version. So start with a simplified example. So we have 5 TAZs here, 3 in the north and 2 in the south. And these dots are the centroids where the model assumes the trips are generated from. These TAZs are connected by roadway network. So the model first estimates how many trips are generated from one zone to the other. And it develops a trip table. It shows the number of trips from one zone to the other between every zone pair. So next step, the model estimates the shortest path from one zone to the other, and similarly develops a table that shows the distance between the zones. And then the model multiplies the number of trips to the distance between the zones to develop a weighted distance table, as you can see on the bottom here. So this is the total miles traveled from one zone to the other zone. And then here's an example of how the average trip length is calculated separately for north and south. So for trips going to the north, we have this calculation here. We sum up all the weighted distance to the north, and then we have the total trips to the north, and then we divided the miles to the number of trips to get the average trip length to the north, and similar the average trips to the south. So that's a simplified example of how trip length is calculated. And then in the model, we divided all the TAZs into the north service area and the south service area. And here the model determines the shortest route from point 1 to point 2. And because for the RRIF calculation, we only want to include the regional road portion. So the freeway distance and also the local distance are excluded. So we only have this orange color to show the regional trip distance. So even though the total distance is 20 miles, we only include 8.8 miles as the RRIF calculation for the regional road distance. So this process is repeated for calculating the distance between zones for every TAZ. So with that distance, the trips between the zones, the average trip lengths to the north and to the south can be calculated. So there is some difference between the previous version and the current version. These are the factors that may have affected the results. First is the land use forecast. So this is the TAZ input we got from TMRPA. So previously for the 2040 RTP model runs, we used the 2016 consensus forecast results. And then in the 2050 version, we used the 2020 consensus forecast. So that could have had some impact on the trip length calculation. And then we also had different network improvements planned in these two RTP versions. So because in the network, we coded in all the capacity projects. So the 2040 RTP had different planned improvements compared with the 2050 version. And then the last one was the model versions. So since the 2040 RTP model, we updated the travel demand model based on the latest travel survey we did in 2015. And I'm gonna go into each of these factors separately. So this slide shows the 2030 land use forecast from 2040 and 2050 RTPs. And the map on the left here shows a comparison of the population in each TAZ. So you can see in the 2040-50 RTP, we had more population forecasted for the 2030 model year. This is what we used for the RRIF calculation. And by TAZ, this map here shows the green TAZs are where the 2050 RTP showed less population than the 2040 RTP, and the orange TAZs are where the 2050 RTP showed greater population than the 2040 RTP. Similar for the employment, also 2050 RTP had more predicted employment than the 2040 version for the 2030 model year. And also these green cells are showing where the 2050 predicted less employment than the 2040, and then the orange colors are showing the 2050 employment is greater than the 2040. So this TAZ input difference obviously would affect the results from the model and how the TAZs are generating different different number of trips. And next, also in the on the network side, the 2050 RTP had a different planned improvements compared with the 2040 RTP. These orange lines are showing the capacity projects that are coded into the model, and you can see there's some differences. For example, the 395 to Pyramid Way connector previously was coded into the model as in the 2030 model year, and this version of RTP, because it was pushed further into the future, so we don't have that in the 2030 model network. We also have some projects from the South Meadows study that were identified in the South Meadows planning study, and those are included in the 2050 RTP, which weren't in the 2040 RTP. Similarly, there's some privately funded projects such as the Daybreak and the Stonegate. So these different network inputs also change the trip length calculation results. And finally is the different versions of the model. So in the 2040 RTP update, we used a model that's calibrated based on 2005 household travel survey. So these are the regional household travel survey we do every 10 years. Is different than the one Dale was talking about. So this is survey. These surveys are done especially for the calibration of our travel demand model. So it's done typically every 10 years. So we can keep track of the changes in people's travel behaviors in Washoe County. So just a comparison of the average trip lengths from the two different surveys. So in 2005, we had the 3.5 miles from this survey, and 8 miles in the 2015 survey. This is the latest one we have. And the 2050 RTP model is based on this latest survey we have. So we changed the parameters in the model, so the model reflects what we observed in the survey and the data we collected from the survey. So next time we're gonna do a household travel survey in 2025. I know we have questions about how this last year, the pandemic, is going to affect the assumptions we have in our planning process. The answer is we do not want to pick a special year such as last year as the model's basis, but we do realize that event like last year may change people's behavior long term. So people may start to work from home more. So this may be reflected in the next travel survey. So once we have this travel survey data, we adjust our model to have the model represent the real world. So based on the travel survey data, we calibrated model, and this is a comparison of the previous model and the current model. So in terms of the VMT in 2030 model year, you can see the 2050 model generated more VMT, but the 2040 model had more number of trips. So when you look at the trip lengths, the 2050 model is predicting more, longer trips than the 2040 model. And this table here shows the comparison of the RRIF average trip length calculation to north and to south, and as Dale showed earlier. So the 2050 model generated longer average trip length than 2040 model. So this is my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hey, Xuan, this is Bill Thomas. Real quick, just did the math. Maybe I did it wrong because it's not my strong suit. But when you look at the difference between the 5.83 and the 7.62, it looks like about a 30% growth. Just trying to get to Randy's question about where the 30% come from.
Yes, I didn't do the calculation either, but this is a different measure than the average trip length we use in the RRIF calculation, because this is only for the regional roads, and this one is just a rough calculation I did to compare. So just by divided the VMT by the total number of trips, this trip length can include more than we actually calculate for the RRIF, including the freeway, local, and also centroid connectors. Those are the connectors that connect the centroids to the roadway network. Those are not real actual roads, but just as a comparison to see how the trip length increased between the two different versions.
So this is Dale. To Bill's point too, if you look at the bottom ones, the north and south, that growth is roughly about 28%. for both north and south areas on VMT growth. So getting to that 30% Randy was talking about there.
Question, Schwen.
Mhm.
How do you say Schwen?
Yeah.
Thank you, John Krompatic here. So what, explain, I know Dale touched on it, as did you, but this 200% increase in 10 years on the survey trip length. Who was surveyed, and what is the significance of the survey?
So during the regional household travel survey, we typically, I personally did the 2015 household travel survey. This 2005 survey was before I joined the RTC. But for the 2015 survey, we surveyed our goal was to survey at least 1% of the total households in Washoe County. And by the time we finished, we actually got more than 1%. So we strategically select households to represent the different demographic backgrounds, income levels, number of vehicles in the households, things like that. So these are the factors we look at also in the model. So after we select these households, and then we send them questionnaires, and they were supposed to fill out the diary to record it for the entire day, each person in the household, how they traveled, where they traveled, and to report those back to us. And we use the data to do analysis and to calibrate the model. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. It's just a source of data. It's not like, I mean, it's basically somebody saying, well, I'm running, I don't know what, 8 miles to work today versus 3.5, 10 years ago. I don't know. I guess it's just some criteria you have, right? It's another metric that folds in.
Yeah, so in the questionnaire, it's actually people report their trips by place. So for example, in the morning, they report starting from home, and then next place they stop is gonna be either their home, and for the whole day we'll have a complete picture of where they have been traveled to, and also they report the mode that they use, how long it took them, and things like that. It's a very complete survey, and if you're interested, the survey report is available on our website, and it has a detailed documentation of what's been done in the survey.
Thank you.
Schwinn, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
The state of Nevada requires that to register your vehicle, you have to enter your odometer, and then when you re-register it, you enter the odometer reading. That registration is tied to an address because it comes in the mail. Could RTC coordinate with the DMV to get a more scientific actual number based on odometer readings tied to addresses, as opposed to a survey, as John was referring to, is like, well, this day I drove 8 miles, this day I drove 3 miles. Okay, these folks went to this place, we went to the movies, you know. So we've also had an interesting year in terms, like John brought up a few meetings ago, people staying home through COVID. So the survey is a little suspect to me in terms of reliability, but yet we have this tool that is being requested, I'm sure at some point with electric vehicles, that we may have to utilize this for to replace the gas tax as we're seeing that decrease. Why wouldn't RTC try to coordinate a information grab from DMV?
So this is only the average trip length here is only a small portion of the data we can collect from these surveys. So in the model, we really want to see the correlation of people's social demographic background related to their travel survey. say people with different income levels, how it's affecting their travel rates and how long they travel. And these things and trip purpose is also an important factor in the model. So in order to get all these, to build these correlations and to adjust the model parameters, we need all the details. So just looking at the miles traveled is not enough information for us. But in the survey, we did use GPS trackers on about 10% of our samples. So when they report their trips, we also compare with the GPS logs. So to make sure what they report is actually what happened. And also if it didn't, we know how to adjust them.
Okay. I have a second question, Schwinn, unless someone else has one. In your presentation on you had a map of the Truckee Meadows and it had orange and green or red and green on it. I believe in your presentation, you identified that the areas in red were going to grow substantially in terms of population for 2050. I think I can test that a little bit, unless I'm looking at the map wrong, because a lot of that land that is identified as red is not within the TMSA and is not identified for growth at all. It's a rural development area. So I'm concerned that it's being identified for substantial amounts of growth in this model.
Hi,
Yeah,
Schwinn, can I weigh in on that? This is Jeremy from Team RPA.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I think what might be, I mean, I agree with what this is showing, but what might be slightly misleading is the magnitude of the change. And so, like you look down to the very south on the left pane and you see Washoe Valley is orange, indicating that the 2050 RTP forecast for the 2030 land use year was higher than what came for the 2040 RTP. This doesn't show it by how much higher, right? So in the rural area, I just looked at the stats there in terms of what we modeled. Only 1% of the 50,488 units out to 2050 occurred outside the TMSA. So it's a small change, but it's coming up as a big orange blob because it's a big area, but it could be 1 unit more. You know, we could look closer and provide a map that shows the magnitude of change spatially. It's because some of these are probably almost a wash, but some probably have a significant difference based on the modeling, like Stonegate, as someone mentioned over on the left pane again. If you look up to the northwest there, you can see orange south of 395. That's Stonegate building, which in our 2040 RTP, Stonegate was not approved and didn't get modeled. So in that case, the change is probably a significant shift of units from probably further north than Evans Ranch previously down to Stonegate. So I think what would help with these maps would be if we did a couple of versions that showed the magnitude of change.
Yeah. Yeah, you understood what I was saying, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we'll see a huge amount of growth in the forested area up toward Mount Rose.
Absolutely not. No, exactly. And I think, again, it ends up being 504 units got modeled into the area outside the TMSA over the 30-year growth period we modeled. So a small amount.
Thank you, Schwinn and Jeremy.
I have a couple of questions for Schwinn. First, thanks for the information. That this is the first time I've seen it. It gives me a better perspective on what makes up this average trip length increase. I think it'd be helpful for the group to have a copy of your presentation. If you have that forwarded to us, I think that'd be helpful. Trying to sift through all these numbers and graphs in a few minutes is not very acceptable from my standpoint, but would certainly be better for people to look at over time. So I do appreciate the information. Just to try to kind of summarize where I think we are, the model differences are clear in terms of the differences between the two affecting trip length. It would be good to have some more detail, as Jim mentioned, on what the intensity of that growth is and where it occurs. That would be one component. The other component is a survey component, and we've had the survey component problem before. It goes back before most of you folks were even involved in this project. But the survey components now, the new survey versus the old survey, is definitely going to have a dramatic impact. And I think it'd be helpful. It sounds like the new survey is already on the web, which is good. I'll look for that so I have a chance to look at it. Are there any old copies of the old survey anywhere and the results of that survey?
Yeah, I have a report from that's for the old survey.
Could you forward that to me? I don't know if anybody else wants to see it because it's going to be a bunch of numbers, but I'm just curious to see what the difference is between those two surveys, the responses, the responders to those surveys, and kind of what their comments were. It sounds like there's more cars per respondent than there was originally. I'm not sure I understand that component, and I'd kind of like to get into that a little more deeper.
Yeah, I can share the survey with you after the meeting.
Appreciate it. Anybody else who wants it, let her know.
Hey, this is Dale. We'll make sure the whole committee receives any of the information we send out to the group or to individually.
Okay, that'd be good. Thanks, Schwinn. I appreciate the presentation. It's very helpful.
Thank you.
Dale, if I could add something, I think one thing Schwinn pointed out that is important, not just for now, but also as we're thinking longer term, is the impact that our construction of new roads is going to have on this number. Because again, for purposes of this program, we're looking at regional roads. And a lot of our new road construction is focused on getting cars off of the freeway network and onto new regional roads. So a facility like Veterans Parkway Extension pulled a lot of cars off of the freeway system. And we have a number of additional projects in the North Valleys that are designed to do the same thing. So I think that's something, as we're talking about the network, that we might want to consider moving forward. And I did just for my own personal, I wasn't here in 2005, but I was here in 2007. And see, my personal commute has gone from about 4 miles to 11 miles from then to today. So I know that's just one anecdotal piece, but I think it is indicative of some of the expansion of our suburban development that we've seen over that time.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Schwinn. Any other further questions for Schwinn on this agenda item? If not, may I have a motion to acknowledge receipt of the report?
So moved.
Second, Kropotkin.
So moved by Mr. Randy Walter and Kropotkin second. Any other discussion? That was for you, Jim. All right, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes. Moving on to agenda item number 6, member announcements and updates. Any announcements from the committee or any updates? Hearing none, we will move to item number 7, public comment. Yanni, any other public comment come in for the meeting?
No public comment was received.
Great, no action is needed. Last agenda item here, number 8, adjournment. Do we have a motion for adjournment?
Move to adjourn. Chesney.
Chesney, motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Miss Shelley Reed. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes. Meeting is adjourned at 9:36 a.m. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today.
Have a good
Thank you.
weekend, everybody.
Thank you.